So where do 3D cameras come into play inside of After Effects? Well, let's build a little scene in 3D and then make a camera and see what we can do with it. So I'm going to make this kind of 80s themed 3D grid that you've probably seen a million times, but it'll serve as a great example for what the camera is capable of. So I'm going to start by making a new solid, coming up to Layer, New Solid. And I'm going to make it square, so we'll call it 2000 by 2000 and call this one Grid. And click OK. The color can be whatever we want it to. And then I'm going to add the grid effect. So I'll come over to my effects and presets, type in grid, and then under the generate category, just click and drag grid over to that layer, and I have a grid. Now I want to make this grid a little bit smaller, so I'm going to change the size from corner point to width slider. I'll click on that, and then that will make the squares much smaller. I can scale this up or down using the width controller right here. Then I'll just make the border, say, 3 pixels wide, and we're good to go. So now I have this grid layer, and I want to enable the 3D switch for it so that I can work with it in 3D space. So I'm going to come to my layer switches right here, click on that 3D icon, and now I have my 3D axis handles. I want to rotate this flat so that it's basically a floor. So I'm going to switch to my rotation tool by pressing W on the keyboard, and then click and drag on the red X handle to rotate this in 3D space on the X-axis. You can do this with any of these axes on a 3D layer. So let me undo back to where we were. I'll click and drag on that again, but this time I'm going to hold Shift so that it snaps to 45-degree increments. So I'll go until it's at 90 degrees, it's flat, completely invisible because it's perfectly in the center of my comp. And remember, this is just a 2D layer existing in 3D space. In order to see any of it, I need to move it down a little bit. So with it selected and having my selection tool active, I'm just going to click and drag down on the Z-axis. And right away you can start to see some perspective. If I go up or down, you can see that grid is now existing in 3D space. So I'll just move it down a little bit so that it's kind of at the floor of my scene, and that looks good. Let's make this a nice bright magenta color, maybe a little bit more purple, something 80s vibe. Click OK, and we're good to go. I'm going to make my comp viewer a little bit bigger just so I can see this at 100%, and maybe increase the border size by 1 point just so we can see that grid a little bit nicer. Next, let's add another solid in the background, so I'll press Command or Control Y on a PC to make a new solid, and this one can just be the comp size. My comp is just 1280 by 720, so it renders a little bit quicker. We'll call this BG for background and make it maybe a dark purple color. We can always adjust this. And I just want to make sure that goes in the background. This layer does not need to be 3D because I just wanted to fill up the background with color. That's a little bright, so I'm going to add a fill to this layer by typing in fill in my effects and presets. Click and drag the fill effect to that background and then make it a darker purple. Something like that, okay? Next, let's make just like a little sunset in the background. So I'm going to double click on my ellipse tool to make an ellipse shape layer, and then double tap U on the keyboard to bring up the modified properties. That's a really quick way to get into the size of the path, and that way I can just make this a perfect circle by typing in, say, 400 by 400. That's probably too big, so I'll link those two properties and scale it down maybe about that big. So around 250, we'll round that off. Okay, I'm going to rename this by selecting it, pressing Enter, and just call this Sun, and then move it up. Now this has a stroke on it. I do not need a stroke, so I'm just going to disable that by clicking on the little eyeball next to the stroke. And I want to give this kind of a sunset gradient to it. So I actually want to change the fill type. So with that selected, I'll come up to the little fill options in my toolbar and click, and change this to a gradient, a linear gradient. Click OK, and then I need to change the actual colors of that gradient. So let me twirl that open under my gradient fill, click on Edit Gradient, and most of these colors I don't need. So I'm just going to click and drag them down to remove them. And really I just need 2 colors. This yellowy to orange is actually looking pretty good. Maybe I'll make the orange just a little bit more magenta. Something like that. So it goes from yellow to magenta. I like that. Click OK, and I just want to change the angle a little bit. So I'm going to bring this down to the bottom, bring this one up to the top, and that's how you can edit a gradient of a shape layer, just by grabbing those little handles. You can also adjust the positions here. So really the X value on both of these should be 0, and that way it's perfectly up and down. To finish this off, I'm going to add an effect called Venetian Blinds. So with that selected, I'm going to go over to my effects and presets, type in Venetian, and there we go. I want to make sure that I use the transition, not the animation preset. Click and drag that onto the shape layer, and then change the completion to say 50%, and rotate the direction 90 degrees. That's looking great. Now I think I'm just going to drag this down a little bit and have it kind of look like it's setting behind this grid. So let's move it right about here, and I want to mask off the bottom of this circle. To do that, I'm just going to go into my shape layer and use the merge paths operation to do this. Now, if you're a little bit lost with my shape layers workflow, I have an entire class dedicated to shape layers called the Ultimate Guide to Shape Layers in After Effects. So definitely check that out if you want to learn more about shape layers. But none of this is really essential for learning how a 3D camera works. I'm just setting up a scene so it's a little bit easier to understand. So I'm going to go into the add and say a rectangle so that I can have a second rectangle path to use as a matte or a mask. And I'm going to make it a little bit wider so it's as wide or wider than the circle, and then make this a little bit taller, and then move it down to right basically where the grid ends. Okay, then I'm going to click on the contents and add a merge paths. That's going to automatically add a stroke and another fill. I don't need those, so I'm going to delete them. And I just need to make sure I go back into my ellipse and move that gradient fill down below the merge paths. Okay, now I'll close those two shapes up, go into my merge paths, and change the mode from add to subtract. And that's all there is to it. I can now move this group up and down if I want more or less of that circle to show up. But I'd say that looks pretty good. Now the last thing I want to do with this is just pre-compose it so that all the effects and the gradients, everything that I've done to this just stays exactly the way that it is. So I'm going to select that layer, come up to layer, and all the way down to pre-compose, and I'll just name this sun. Click on OK, and now if I move it around, we can see that we have this 2D layer. All of the effects are contained within the pre-comp. So I'll undo to get back to where it is, and now I need to enable the 3D layer switch for it. So I'll click on that 3D layer, and if we switch from our active view to our custom view 1, we can see that this is actually right in the dead center of our scene, and I want it to be right all the way at the back where the grid ends. So I need to click and drag this on the Z-axis backwards. It's going to be actually a little bit easier to do this if I look at this from the top down. So let's switch from our custom view 1 to the top view, and now I need to zoom out so I can see all of the grid and the sun. And like we've already seen, I can navigate around this using some of the camera tools. So let me click and hold down on the camera tools, and what I'll do first is go to my Track Z camera tool. You can see that the keyboard shortcut for all of these is C. So if I just press C on the keyboard over and over again, it just cycles through them. So I'll just keep pressing it till I get to that Track Z. And you can think of this like zooming in and out of your scene, or moving closer or further away from it. So I'll just back this up by clicking and dragging down until I can see the whole grid. Perfect. And then I'll switch back to my selection tool. This is the bounding box for the sun layer, and it's purple, so it's matching in with that grid a lot. So I'm just going to change the color of this layer by clicking on the label, and let's just make it something bright like cyan. That way we can see it a lot clearer. Alright, now I'll click and drag on that Z-axis until it's basically lined up with the top of that layer. It doesn't have to be perfect, just as long as it looks like it's at the end of that grid. Then I'll switch back to my active camera, and you can see that it now needs to move down a little bit. I know for sure that it's right lined up with the back of the grid layer. It's just floating above it. So let me just click and drag down on that Y-axis until the bottom of that sun meets the bottom of that grid, and that looks perfect. Now you can see that the bounding box in this layer goes out really far. That's just because when we pre-composed the layer, it made the pre-comp the same size as this comp. That bothers me a little bit, so I'm just going to double click to go inside of it, come up to composition, down to composition settings, and then just scale this down on the width and height until it fits that sun shape just a little bit better. I'll unlock the aspect ratio and just bring it in a little bit tighter, and then click OK. Alright, I'll close out of that, and now that just fits the shape of the contents a little bit nicer. I do, however, want to scale this up a little bit, so I'm just going to click and drag while holding Shift to make it a little bit bigger, and then pull this up on the Y-axis until it lines up with the bottom again. So right about there, it lines up with the grid. Alright, so here's our very basic 3D scene. I think I'm going to make my grid spacing just a little bit bigger, so I'll click and drag on the width. That looks good. Now that we have our 3D scene, how do we actually do something with it? How do we move around it and make it look a little bit more interesting? Well, that's where 3D cameras come into play. So let's come up to Layer and go down to New and say Camera. This is going to open up our camera settings window and give us a lot of crazy looking options that are all very confusing if you don't know what you're dealing with. But we're going to walk through all of them in this class, so don't get too overwhelmed. For now, what we're going to do is just use a preset. So come over to the preset menu and change this from custom down to, say, 50 millimeters. All of these presets are based on real world camera lenses, but we'll just say 50 millimeters because that's kind of a standard view. Make sure that your type is set to one node camera, and just make sure that enable depth of field is unchecked. We'll talk about that in a little bit. Once that's done, just click on OK, and absolutely nothing has changed, and that's actually totally fine. Having a 3D camera in our scene, however, allows us to now navigate around it the same way that I was when I was in the Custom View 1. So these camera tools are now going to control this camera layer. So let's just go to the first camera tool, Unified Camera Tool, and see what happens. Well, if I click and drag in my scene, you can see that it's basically rotating the camera around. It's changing what the camera is looking at. And the best way to get a grasp on what's actually happening here is to think about a camera layer as if you were looking through an actual camera in the real world. So think about using a DSLR or even just your phone. If you open up the camera and look through it, this tool is basically just changing what your camera is looking at. And you can see as I click and drag, it's switched to this kind of rotation tool icon with a circle or a sphere in the middle. The Unified Camera Tool basically allows you to switch between the other three using modifier keys. So by default, just clicking and dragging will switch to the Orbit tool. Let me undo to get back to our standard view. If I were to hold down Control and then click and drag, this is going to be the Track Z camera tool, and I can move in and out on my scene. Okay, let me undo that again. You can do the exact same thing by right-clicking and dragging. It doesn't have to be the modifier key. All right, let me undo to get back to where we were, and if I switch to my Track XY camera tool, this is going to move around in the X and Y axis, or just pan around the scene. So those three tools are pretty easy to understand if you just think about using an actual camera in the real world. The Orbit camera tool allows you to change what your camera is pointed at. The Track XY camera tool allows you to pan around the scene on the X or Y axis, so up and down or left and right. And then the Track Z camera tool allows you to move on the Z axis, in and out, getting closer or further away from your scene. Those are the very basics of controlling a 3D camera inside of After Effects. It can get a lot more complex, especially with modifying some of those camera settings, but again, we're going to cover all of those in this class, so don't worry about it. The next thing I want to talk about is the field of view. Let's change our comp viewer again so we can see this from multiple angles. So again, go down to the one view and change it to 2 views horizontal. In our top-down view, you can see that there's this green object in our scene now. Remember, looking top-down, we see that grid from the top. The sun layer, because it's perfectly up and down on that X and Y axis, we're not seeing any depth of it. We're not seeing the front of it. We're just looking straight down from the top. But we have this third object in our scene that's green. And this is the 3D camera. It is a visual representation of where your camera is in your scene from the top down. So the actual camera is represented by this rectangle right here. You can think of that like the body of the camera if this was in the real world. And if I click on it, you can see that we have those same 3D axis handles available to us. So I can click and drag to move this in or out, and you see how that's updating in our active camera view. I can move it left and right on the X axis, and I can move it up and down on the Y axis. Okay, but what is this triangle that we're seeing coming out from the camera? This is the field of view, which is often abbreviated FOV. This is a term used in the real world, but it's also applicable to 3D cameras on computers. What it's representing is what the camera can actually see. So it's ending right here in the middle of the scene, but you can just imagine this extending out into infinity at these angles. anything outside of this triangle is not going to be visible in your active camera view. So if I move this a lot closer, just so we can line this up with the sun, and then I move the camera over to the point that part of this layer is outside of the triangle, you can see that it's now getting cut off in our active camera view. It is outside of the field of view of this camera. And we can modify this field of view. Let me undo, go back to where we were. If you remember when we made this camera in the camera settings, we chose 50 millimeters. That corresponds to real world measurements of camera lenses, but that millimeters measurement is what determines your field of view, or how much of your scene you can see with your 3D camera. So just for fun, I'm going to duplicate this sun a couple times. So I'm going to press Command or Control D with it selected and move it just outside of view on the comp. So there we go. And then I'll duplicate it one more time and do the same thing on the other side. So currently with this field of view, the 50 millimeter lens, we cannot see those two extra suns. But if I have my camera layer selected and come up to Layer, Camera Settings, I can adjust this preset. So let's just take a look at these numbers again. With camera lenses, the smaller the diameter or the millimeters measurement, the wider angle lens it is, the greater the field of view, the more you can see at the edges of the frame. And the higher the number, the more zoomed in the lens is, the less field of view you have, but it allows you to be further away from your subject and still be nice and zoomed in and see objects far away in really good detail. Now in After Effects, this is a computer program, we're not limited to these fixed millimeter measurements, but because they correspond to real world lenses, it's a great starting point. We can always modify this after the fact. So just to give you an idea of how this is working, let me switch to say 135, and I immediately see what that's going to look like because I have preview checked. If I uncheck it, you can see it goes back to where it was. But let's pay attention to this view over here. You can see that that triangle gets a lot skinnier and longer, and at the same time the field of view gets much narrower. Less of my scene is visible within this 135 millimeter preset. And if we go in the opposite direction, so say from 50 millimeters to 24 millimeters, it gets a lot squattier, but the field of view, if you extend these lines out, is much greater. And we can see all of these suns now because our lens is basically zoomed out. We have a greater field of view. That's a really important concept to understand because it actually affects the way that your scene looks a lot. As you can see, if I uncheck preview again, this is kind of the way that we designed our scene to look. This is how we expect it to look. But just by changing the field of view, everything looks a lot bigger. Let's leave this at the 24 millimeter preset, click OK, and then just move our camera in a bit so that this grid is kind of lined up where it was already. So something like this. Those suns look a lot further away. The grid has changed a lot. So let's do a little experiment here. I'm going to move the camera just to where this grid is touching the bottom of the frame. Okay, and this is our 24 millimeter camera, so I'm going to name this 24 millimeters. And then I'm going to duplicate this layer so that we now have two cameras in our scene. If I move this around, you can see there are two cameras. I'll undo that, and After Effects by default takes the higher camera in the layer stack and makes that the active camera. That's something important to know. You never really want more than one camera layer existing at the same time in a comp, but just to make this a little less confusing, I'm going to disable the visibility of our first camera. With the second one selected, I'll come up to Layer, Camera Settings, and let's change this from 24 millimeters to say 80 millimeters. So it's further zoomed in. I'll click OK, and I want to back this up until, again, that grid is lined up with the base of our comp, right about there. Okay, and I'll rename this layer 80 millimeters, and I want to compare these two views now. Remember, both cameras are lined up so that the grid is right lined up with the base of the comp. So let me turn the 24 millimeter camera back on. We can see the differences between these two. This 24 millimeter camera has to be much closer to get the grid to line up where we want it. The 80 millimeter camera can be much further back. But to be able to switch between these two easily, I'm just going to click and drag the 80 millimeter camera forward so that the topmost camera is the one that's active at this point in time. And I'll even just trim this down so that they don't overlap. I'll hold shift to snap it right there. And now I can just scrub between these two views and we can very easily see the difference. So on the 24mm view, pay attention to how square this grid looks. Each one of these cells is pretty much a square. It's very obvious those are squares. But if I switch to my 80mm, they're way more compressed. It looks much more like rectangles. Even though we have the two different cameras lined up so that we see the same amount of the grid, you can see that the lens that's much more zoomed in and has much less field of view kind of compresses the entire scene. It makes the sun look a lot closer. It makes the grid look a lot shallower. Whereas the wider 24mm lens makes it look like the grid is really, really big and that sun is just a really far distance away. It completely changes the perspective of your scene. Nothing within the scene has changed. We didn't do anything to the suns or the grid. It's literally just changing the field of view of the camera lens that we're looking through. And the reason I'm spending so much time giving you these examples is because I really want you to be able to visualize how these things are affecting your scene. Because once you have a good grasp on how adjusting these properties affects the way that your scene looks, you don't have to do so much troubleshooting trying to figure out how to get your scene to look the way that you actually want it to. You waste a lot less time messing around with settings and seeing what happens, and you spend more time just knowing how things work and how to get things to do what you actually want them to. Let's talk a little bit about why you would even want a 3D camera in your scene at all. Because before we had these cameras, we still were working in 3D space. And I can move these layers around in 3D space. I can animate things in 3D. So what's the benefit of using cameras? Well, one of the reasons is something we just learned about, which was the perspective that the cameras give. So it allows us to change something like this grid, which is a really obvious thing to see the perspective change on based on the zoom level of your camera. Without those cameras, you don't get that. The default active camera in After Effects is just a 50mm lens. So if I were to make a new camera that was 50mm, hit OK, it doesn't change the scene at all. But I'll delete that camera and make a new camera that is, let's say, 20mm and click OK, and it completely changes the perspective of my scene. So that's the first reason. It allows you to control the perspective of your scene, but it also allows you to just move around the scene as if these were real objects in the real world and you just had a camera moving around them. If we had a much busier scene with lots of objects in them, we could just maybe parent them all to a 3D null and animate the null around to kind of simulate camera movement, but that's the whole point of 3D cameras. It allows us to animate a camera as if it was a real camera in physical 3D space.